Ladies and gentlemen, we are now moving on to our recurring CSTD special event called A Conversation with Great Minds. In this segment, we invite renewed scholars and thinkers to provide thought-provoking insights and latest trends from cutting-edge research at the intersection of STI and socio-economic development. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Ms. Julia Seeger, who will be our moderator for this special event. Ms. Seeger is the presenter of the Tech 24 program on France 24. She is a French-American journalist fascinated by technology. As well as hosting Tech 24, she produces content for the English and French news bulletins on France 24. She previously worked for France 5 and CBS 2 New York. Ms. Seeger, you have the floor.
Excellencies, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. In the last few years, countries around the world have experienced economic pain, first because of the pandemic and now because of geopolitical disruptions and environmental threats. Countries in the global south are left particularly vulnerable with a food, fuel, and finance crisis looming. Now, this may seem like a very pessimistic prospect, but new ways forward are emerging. According to UNCTAD's Technology and Innovation Report 2023, the wave of technological change triggered by renewables and green technologies is opening new opportunities, new windows of opportunities for developing countries first, not only to build resilience and mitigate climate disasters, but also to spur economic growth and technological development. So harnessing green tech, if you will, can help them leap out of this cascade of crisis. But this is only true if countries can act swiftly and if they can jump on that already moving train. So in a nutshell, green tech is a powerful and immediate leverage for growth and for social resilience that also happens to offer a more sustainable future. Now, the reason I encourage all of our delegates here to read this report is that it's not just a list of the issues at stake here. It also offers very pragmatic solutions with a Frontier Technology Readiness Index. So I want to thank at this point UNCTAD for this very much needed pragmatic approach. Now, many innovations to reduce the impacts of climate change are currently being developed throughout the world, let it be high-tech or frugal innovation. But the other question that will remain is how to scale these innovations, these tools, and to do so at speed to meet the needs of everyone, especially the 3.5 billion people who live in countries the most highly vulnerable to climate change. Climate change, as you all know, is a global issue that calls for global solutions and hence to cooperation. This means sharing knowledge and technologies with all countries equally. And needless to say, that most of the technology and expertise is still housed in very few countries. This year's conversation with great minds will address issues including how to prioritize R&D for climate change, especially for the most vulnerable people, how to share knowledge and technology, and what should be the role of government and the UN to help. Without further ado, I'm honored to introduce our distinguished panelists. Please welcome remotely from Japan, Professor Hiroshi Amano. He's a physicist, engineer, inventor, and professor working at the Institute of Materials and Systems for Sustainability at Nagoya University. He was awarded the 2014 Nobel Prize in Physics together with Isami Akasaki and Shuichi Nakamura, for the invention of efficient blue light emitting diodes, which has enabled bright and energy-saving white light sources. Mr. Amano, or Professor Amano, was also elected as a member of the National Academy of Engineering in 2016 for the development of P-type gallium nitride doping, enabling blue semiconductor LEDs. So thank you so much for joining us. And
Thank
also
you.
sitting beside us is Professor Karen Scrivener. Professor Scrivener, of course, is a material chemist known for her pioneering work in cementitious materials. She is the head of Laboratory of Construction Materials at École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, and also served as the editor-in-chief of the Cement and Concrete Research Journal for the last 15 years. Mrs. Scrivener was elected Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering in 2014, and she also plays an active role in promoting sustainable cements in the form of blended cements. Hello and welcome to you as well. It's an honor to have you with us. Before we take a deep dive into this conversation, I would like to invite both of our panelists to start with their open statements and more precisely tell us how your innovation is helping mitigate the climate crisis.
Okay.
Perhaps hello, Professor Amano, thank you for joining us. Could you please start with your opening statement?
Okay. Can you see my slides or?
We do see your slides.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for inviting me. Today, I'd like to explain the new semiconductor materials, that is gallium nitride, GaN, which can be used as a tool for realizing sustainable development goals. As it is introduced, the contribution of gallium nitride-based LED lightings for energy saving are huge. According to the US Department of Energy, from 2017 to 2035, within these 18 years, the people in the United States can save about 22.9 petawatt hour, which correspond to 890 billion US dollars. And we are seeking the next innovation. It's a power devices in power supply. If you use any kind of electrically driven systems, you need a power supply. Power supply have the role of changing AC to DC or DC to AC electric power, or regulate voltage or convert frequencies. Why the gallium nitride is so attractive? The reason is by replacing the conventional silicon-based power devices, we can reduce the loss to 1/10. The gallium nitride is 10 times more efficient than silicon. Then we estimate the cost of transforming Japan into a renewable energy centered country by 2050s. Our calculation shows that in Japan, we need 165 trillion Japanese yen to realize a really renewable energy centered country, which is very, very expensive. However, we can reduce the CO2 emissions of 1.18 billion tons by 2050 by several technologies like end of coal use or bioplastic or direct air carbon capture and storage, and end of petroleum fuel use. And more importantly, in case of Japan, we can reduce the primary energy usage by replacing to renewable energy centered system. So at the initial time, we have to consider the deficit, but from 2044, we can expect the total surplus by replacing the primary energy to renewable energy-based systems. And we already demonstrate the new material, gallium nitride-based devices, capable for saving energy consumption. So we demonstrated the new electric vehicles using the gallium nitride technologies. Maybe many of you knows the Tesla. In Tesla, there's the new material, silicon carbide, is used for inverter. But by using the gallium nitride inverter, we can further reduce the size and weight of the inverter. And we already realized the reduction of inverter loss like this. 55% reduction have been already achieved. So this is the Tesla inverter system. It's an American map, but by using the gallium nitride inverter, we can realize the Japan map inverter. And there are several technology or initiative necessary to achieve a carbon neutral society. And we surely realize the carbon neutral society by 2050. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Professor Amano, thank you very much indeed for that. Professor Karen Scrivener, if you could please start with your opening statement.
So thank you very much. It's a great honor to be invited to participate in this session. So I'm working on cement and concrete are receiving increasing attention. I think now most people know that these are contributing about 8% to our CO2 emissions every year. But we have to realize that this important contribution is not because they're very polluting materials. They're actually lower carbon than most other materials we have. It's simply because we use so much of them. We use 30 billion tons of cement and concrete every year. So if we can reduce these emissions, this can make a very important contribution. Now, we don't really have an option to stop building because we have so many people in the world who are still living in very poor conditions. And we've seen that cement and concrete is a tremendous driver for development. If we look in the last 30 years, we have seen the production of cement increase by about 4 or 5 times. And this has been largely because the development has taken place in China, which has lifted many people out of poverty, built high-speed rail networks, etc. In the next 30 years, we're going to see another very important shift. This time, we're going to see a decrease in use of cement and concrete in China, but an increase in those other parts of the developing world, in India, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and most of all, Africa. And so we really need technologies which, as well as allowing this development, can vastly reduce the emissions, and which can be done at large scale and implemented very fast. So this is what we've been working on at EPFL. And about 10 years ago, we came up with a new type of cement where we could substitute a large part of the CO2 producing material with a combination of clay, which we call that calcined because we heat it at a fairly low temperature, and also with limestone. So this development is called LC3, which stands for limestone calcined clay cement, which can reduce emissions compared to existing solutions by more than 40%. And on a global context, this means that if we implement this technology to 2050, it can bring about reductions of more than 800 million tons of CO2 per year. Now, for this to work, it's very important that we make partnerships with the countries where the cement use is highest. Unlike energy, 95% of cement and concrete is really used in what's often called the global south, maybe less than 10% in the global north. So in our work, we've made strong partnerships. First of all, we worked with scientists in Cuba, and then we followed this by focusing on India. And this has all been very successful. I mean, of course, it takes time, but we're now seeing more and more factories switching to this technology. And we need to make sure this technology is in the open domain, because we have more than 3,000 cement plants around the world, and we need to make sure that these technologies can go in as many of these plants as possible. So this is a very exciting technology we're still working on, but we need to go further. And in this respect at EPFL, we're now looking to create what we call a Center for Worldwide Sustainable Construction, which will really seek to expand research across this domain of construction, and particularly to make partnerships so we can form common education programs with people from many countries. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Scrivener. We'll go back to partnerships, of course, and intellectual property in just a moment. But first, Professor Amano as well, when talking about research, there seems to be a dilemma between, on one hand, conducting research to find solutions to very specific problems, versus pursuing fundamental research with no specific practical application, but we know that later it can open a whole new tech revolution. How can we find the right balance between both? And what is your experience in this regard? And perhaps personally, how did you get in the field you're in today? Let's start perhaps with Professor Scrivener, please.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. I think we need, of course, both. And what people chose to do research on will depend on their personalities. So I think what's very important is to encourage diversity, encourage people from different backgrounds, different genders, different geographies to embark on scientific research, because there we will be able to have the best chance of coming up with solutions. From a personal point of view, I always wanted to work on things which had a practical relevance. And I almost kind of, by coincidence, ended up in this field of cement and concrete, because at the beginning it seemed something we didn't know much about. And still in our own research, we really tried to combine more fundamental work, which looks at the underlying mechanisms, but it's also important to have a vision of where this can go in the long term. And I'm lucky there to have had experience also of working in the industry, which is a big plus.
Thank you very much. Professor Amano, on this question of whether we should pursue perhaps
it depends on the age of each researchers. When the researchers are young, the curiosity-driven research is more important, and sometimes leads to unexpected results. But when the people or researchers becomes elder, it becomes more social oriented. So my experience, it depends on the age So when they are young, the curiosity-driven research is more important. And if the people becomes elder, the more social-oriented research would be preferable.
Thank you very much. So earlier, Professor Scrivener, you said that we need to favor all walks of life in science. And one of my questions is, how do we, perhaps many scientists today are going to want to go towards a certain topic because of personal preferences. How can we perhaps stimulate them so that they can go towards innovations that can help mitigate the climate crisis?
Yes, I mean, I think a lot of young people, of course, they're very concerned about the climate, and maybe to a certain extent, they've lost faith in science. You know, they think that everything has to come about by personal actions. But, you know, I think the changes in the way we behave are going to be too slow to encounter this difficulty. And what we have to share with young people is to show them how we can produce results, how we really can lower CO2 emissions through science and technology. I think particularly because many developments will come from the hard sciences like physics and chemistry, which hasn't necessarily been so attractive, particularly to female students who tend to go very much to the life sciences. I think now we really need to convince young girls that, you know, these are areas where they really can do a lot, because I'm really convinced that different ways of thinking, which comes from diversity, is critical to coming up with solutions.
Professor Amano, I can see you nodding.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Professor Amano?
Yes.
On this question, how can we perhaps incite young people to start developing innovations that will help mitigate the climate crisis?
Oh, that's a very important point. Yeah, I think the education is very, very important. Yeah, I have the experience of comparing the education in Sweden and education in Japan for climate change. It's quite different. So the education in the very young age, from primary school, middle school, high school, is very, very important, I think.
I'm going to share with you a personal fear that I have, that something that I see on a daily basis, a new generation coming and being very much anxious about the climate change. And one of my questions is, as a scientist, can you search and can you find if you feel anxious? And my question is, do we have a responsibility to first nurture their love and understanding of science and nature before instilling fear? But at the same time, time is running out, and we've said it. So how do you find the right balance?
Well, that's a deeply philosophical question. I don't know if I can answer that shortly. But again, I think, you know, if we can do things, this relieves our anxiety, you know. So, I mean, not just young people, I'm very anxious often about climate change, and I'm in the privileged position of feeling I can do something about it. So I think that it should not be one then the other. It should be showing to people that their own actions, not only in their own lives, but as they can contribute to technological solutions, can contribute a difference. Many people say to me, it's too late. I think that's really not something we should say, because the point is, yes, we're slower than we should have been, but the point is everything we can do now will make things less bad. And that's what we should focus. We should focus on how can we minimize the impacts, because we're in the starting point we are now. We can't go back to what we should have done 50 years ago, and we have to look forward there. But there are a lot of things we can do.
Professor Amano, what would be your message to young generations? I know that there are also people who are watching us online, and I'd
Mhm.
also like to address them and tell them that at the end of this panel, we will be also taking questions. What would be
Okay.
your message to the young generation?
Yeah, the precise understanding of the real situation is very, very important, I think. So to do that, the science is very, very important to understand what is now, what is the situation of the earth now. So understanding and to run what is going on now is very important to treat or to treat the climate change. And yeah, that's my message to the young generation.
Thank you very much. How can funding for R&D aimed at global challenges such as climate change be brought to appropriate scale? And perhaps how can it connect with national research agendas?
So, well, I think we don't have all the answers to that. You know, in our own work, we were financed for 8 years by the Swiss government, which was very good. And now we have support from philanthropic donations. I think, you know, we need all sources of funding. In some cases, people can develop companies, which then can be funded by venture capital. Not in all fields. I think the main thing is we need to make clear to people, you know, what things can make a difference, you know, because there's many, many ideas out there which just cannot deliver. I mean, you know, my own field of construction materials, everybody says, oh, we should stop using concrete, build everything in wood. Well, that would be very nice, but we're just never going to be able to produce enough wood worldwide to fulfill that. You know, if we wanted to replace just 1/4 of concrete with wood, we would have to plant new forests 1.5 times the size of India, which maybe would be a good thing to do, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. And even if it did happen tomorrow, we'd have to wait 30 years. So again, I really think it's a question of diversity. You know, governments, philanthropic funds, venture capital where it's appropriate, all of these things have to be really conscious about what they can do to help the climate, but also they have to come from a sound understanding of what really can make a difference.
Professor Amano,
Yes.
on this specific question, how can we scale up R&D for climate change applications?
Yeah, the climate change is a global issue. So the only one country is not enough. The partnership or the strong collaboration with every country is essential to treat the climate change. So not only each government or each countries, of course, the companies or other organization, the international organization would be necessary to treat the climate change.
Now, I have a question about how to measure impact, because when we try to incentivize people to try to make them understand the type of impact that a technology can have, sometimes being able to measure the impact and quantify it. But when it comes to climate change, it's not that easy because there's such a domino effect of so many things. So how do you incentivize stakeholders? It's not an easy question.
No, not an easy question. I mean, again, I can refer to the example in my own field. You know, the mistake that has been made in the field of construction is to focus just on the people who are producing cement, and to kind of think that by kind of putting them under pressure, they can come up with some miraculous new solution, which just isn't out there. We have to look at all the steps in the process. So not just the people who produce the cement, but then people who turn it into concrete, and then the people who turn that concrete into buildings. Because only if you work at all these different levels can you achieve the reductions we need. And particularly this thing of benchmarking is very important. You know, you would think it was very simple to be able to evaluate the embodied CO2 in a building, but in fact, it's not at all. This is a task we've taken on now to come up with an international protocol to measure CO2 in buildings. And this kind of technique is very, very important to know how we're doing, you know, and sometimes the results can be quite the opposite of what you think. You know, again, if we look at different materials, you know, you can use concrete in a good way, you can use concrete in a bad way, you can use wood in a good way, you can use wood in a bad way. And what we need to do is to have these tools to find out when we're doing this in a good way, and to systematize that. It's very important to find incentives at all the different levels.
Professor Romano, on this
Yeah.
question, sorry.
Yes.
On
Yeah,
this question of, yes, please.
Yes. Yeah, of course, the sensing technology is very, very important, but it should be very, very expensive. So the low cost sensing technology or global sensing technology would be preferable to justify the quantify the level of climate change. But it should be the low cost. So the cooperation with many the engineers or the industry people are very, very important.
Now, when talking about technologies, of course, these technologies need to be experienced in the field, and that's another issue. There are different jurisdictions, different laws in different countries, sometimes even areas that aren't even regulated at all, like the deep sea, for instance. How can we find solutions and test in the field and scale up these new green technologies?
Yes, this is also where we need to find ways for academics to have a better opportunity to take their ideas out of the lab. So at the minute, we tend to fall too much into this idea in universities that, you know, your mission is to write nice papers, but this is not going to really help anybody at the end of the day. I know from our point of view, when we came up with this idea, and then we discussed with the Swiss Organization for Development and Cooperation how we could really get this into the real world. This was very much a challenge because we really didn't know how to do this, and gradually we found the right people to talk to, and then started to have some success. But I think here we were lucky that, you know, our funders were really pushing us to do something different. And many people in academia, they're not necessarily encouraged to go in that direction. So I don't have good answers here, but this is something we need to think about for the future.
Professor Romano, how important is it for scientists in the lab to stay in touch with the imperatives and the reality of the field?
Oh, okay. Yes. I think the to face the climate change, only the scientists would not be enough. Maybe the collaboration with other fields, especially like economy or politicians, is necessary to treat the climate change. Maybe the scientists can show the real situations, but only the scientists cannot treat or against the climate change. So I think the collaboration with other fields like economy or a politician or other specialists would be necessary.
So cooperation across the board
Yeah.
is one key. Another question I have, we saw with COVID-19, scientists get together during a crisis and come up with an innovative solution in a record time. Are there any lessons learned from COVID that can be applied today to the climate change situation?
Oh. Yes, that's very important point. In case of COVID-19, not only the scientists, but also the politicians that try to control the situation. So and also the for vaccine generation. It is very important for the financial sectors support the scientists. So the COVID-19 case is is one of the good example. Yeah, that I think the collaboration or diversity of the research field is very, very important.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Professor.
And I think, it's really important to realize that these COVID developments didn't come out of nothing. They really benefited, they really built on a lot of research that have been taking place already for decades before. And I think that's the important thing. We can't expect ideas to come out of nothing. We have to have a sound scientific base. We have to start with educating the young people so they understand what the issues are, and then have, well-founded laboratories. And again, as it's a question of diversity.
Now, there's this ongoing debate about intellectual property rights and whether it helps or it hinders scaling technologies. What is your take on this? And specifically with your technology, what choices did you make?
Well, in our case, I've worked in the cement industry for a number of years, and I really saw it's not an industry where you can really exploit intellectual property very easily. So for me, it was quite clear that when we had a new solution, and considering we have 3,000 cement plants worldwide, maybe more like 3 million concrete plants, that you could only have an impact in terms of CO2 if you're trying to get this idea out to as many people as possible. This is the particular domain. you can't imagine nowadays to set up your own cement factory and start selling all over the world. It's a material which has, its own distribution channels. It's very heavily regulated. So, in my particular case, this would not have really been any help. But of course, there are other cases where this is a different case.
Professor Amano, we're
Yes.
really at the beginning of this green tech revolution. And one of the main questions of this panel is, how do we make sure that developing countries can catch this wave, can catch this train that has already left the station?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very important question. Yeah, my feeling is that the developing country has the advantage of installing new systems using new technologies. So I think the developing country is good to try the new technology for solving the climate change rather than the developed countries.
Sorry.
Yep.
Yeah, if I could come in on this, because I think, I'm really passionate about the fact that I think we have to work with the energy and ideas young people have. You know, I mean, this is always what's motivating me when I'm traveling. You know, you go to places in Africa and there's such energy, despite the fact that people are often dealing with very adverse circumstances. And I think we have to find new ways to work with these people. I've been lucky enough to be able to host several people who come for a year to work in my laboratory in Switzerland. But then that's not enough. When they go back to their countries, we have to continue to partner with them and help them to develop their own capacities, because the capacity to exploit these new technologies will depend on having people with the scientific background and skills to really develop them in place. And we must be, you know, we must not be making a sort of brain drain by encouraging these people just to come to nice places, you know, to very wealthy places like Switzerland, you know, and not thinking about where they can use their talents in the long run.
Right, and take into consideration the local particularities of each area, each region. Professor Amano, would you like to also answer this question?
Yes. Yeah. Of course. For the developing country, the most serious problem would be one is the person. Maybe the education is necessary, and the second, how to pay the new systems. Yeah, that's the very important point and very difficult issues. So in such as problem, in this case also the partnership or the collaboration with all the countries would be necessary. So the role of United Nations is very, very important.
Now, another advantage that I see perhaps for developing countries is that in some cases, they can now choose certain solutions for infrastructure, whereas in other countries, they have to completely change what has been established. So, and I think to that regard, the report that we just saw from UNCTAD is really an appeal to favor green technologies today, because in the long run, it will pay back. What is your take on this question?
Well, I mean, yes, clearly this is what we have to do. And I think we also have to realize that in some cases, green technologies can be more expensive to start with, but not always. And, you know, particularly not in the construction field, we often find that solutions can save money. So you have a lot of things you can do which can be done at even lower cost. It's just a question of sharing the knowledge and getting the ways of doing this into the right hands. I mean, at the end of the day, I think, you know, these solutions are going to be expensive because we are going to have to use some measure of carbon capture and storage, but we need to do everything possible to minimize that. And even though we may have to spend a lot of money for green solutions, I think it will be less in the long run than what we will have to spend if we don't do anything. I mean, calculation has been made by many people, much more expert than me, but, you know, the cost of doing nothing is actually going to be more than the cost of doing something, even if we have to make some investment up front.
Now, what can governments and what can the UN do to help, or what can they perhaps stop doing?
Well, I think the UN is a tremendous organization. I don't know it in detail, but I've, you know, participated in a few of these COP meetings. It's completely crazy because there's so much happening all at once. So I think the UN is an important, very important organization for bringing countries together and coming up with agreements. I don't know if I can really say what they should stop doing. I think often that we need to make sure that, we can have some perversities in the system. I mean, like, again, in our own case, we can, by implementing CO2 saving technologies on a global level, then you can maybe have some temporary negative impact on an individual country. And I don't think we yet have mechanisms for dealing with that. But otherwise, I think generally they can do a lot, not always done in the best way and most efficiently, but that's true for any organization. Nothing's perfect.
Professor Amano?
Yes.
Professor Amano?
Yeah. The role of the United Nations would be the first, the sharing, the information sharing, the science results would be very, very important. So in such a vein, the IPCC is a good example of the sharing the information about the climate change. So maybe we need to go the next step or one step further to how to treat the climate change.
I just want to go back on earlier, we spoke about the fact that we really need to go across the board when it comes to stakeholders. And I'd like to go back to financial actors. It's often said, and perhaps this is not true, that when financial actors are onboarded, that's when the interest shifts and that's when we start seeing a big change. What has been your personal experience with VCs and financial actors?
Well, there is, I mean, there's a lot of, how can I say it? I mean, it's like saying that capitalism is the worst system except for every other system kind of thing, like we sometimes say about democracy. It has lots of faults, but also it's, at the end of the day, the things that keeps everything going. I think what's really important is that we need, for me, more important than venture capital has been the movement we've seen in the last few years of companies really stepping up and saying they are committed to delivering zero CO2. This is the important thing, because governments alone can never finance this. It has to be financed by companies. And I think now, largely through public pressure, companies are really realizing if they don't commit to this, this is extremely bad for their share price and everything else they're doing. And I think that's a very positive development, which needs to be accelerated.
So the consumer is also driving the change. On this question, Professor Amano?
Yes. In my case, the majority of my research is funded by the Ministry of Education, Environment. So the governmental funding is very, very important for us. So maybe it's the first stage, but the second stage, the consumer or the other private company or private person should also join our activity. So the person who are interested in or who are engaged in this field, yeah, they should join us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
This time I would like to open the floor for questions for our distinguished delegates, if you have any questions. Gambia?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Amano, Professor Karin, for your insights and your contributions. I'm particularly intrigued by the work that Professor Karin is doing as it relates to cement, concrete, and construction, and its contribution towards the challenges of climate. When I look at our countries in the global south, the idea of infrastructural development is to build more concrete and steel. And certainly it doesn't seem that there is a reversal of that. So efforts like what you're doing is very helpful. And I'm wondering how your work can get into the policy space. If you look at most of our countries in the South, cement and steel is a recent phenomenon. Majority of the construction was actually mud and clay and cow dung and other materials that were used that do not contribute to the crisis. But we increasingly are abandoning that. So I'm wondering what your thoughts, particularly in Africa. And when I think of Egypt, I look at the pyramids, I look at these constructions that have gone over time. I don't think they contributed to the climate. I may be wrong, because I don't think they use cement. So I think that's, I would like you to take us a little bit further on that. What do you see as the role of influencing curriculum for bringing the skills and the talents that are required to return to those elements that can sustain construction and reverse the current trend? Because what I see is increased production, increased location of production factories of cement in the global South. The second question I have is, how can we direct more R&D into technologies and innovations to address climate change, particularly Professor Amano's work as it relates to renewable and green. Now, it is easier for adoption in the North, but for the global South, how do you foresee the global South funding R&D and having R&D rooted and having some of these technologies and skills walk into engineering education among other forms of education? And how do we build STEM? Because we can't continue just to be consuming and not producing. Lastly, the other question is, how can we spread the benefits of these technologies and innovations that are created through R&D to benefit the global South? Do you see our education infrastructure fitted for what is required to truly address climate change? Does it mean that we have to restructure content and knowledge acquisition into our education continuum for us to be able to address greening, renewable, because we have abundance of these in our countries? The resources lay in the South, and the South is not the trigger to climate crisis, but a recipient. So can you please take us to what we are struggling with and the nexus of environment, trade, and sustainable development as it relates to these issues? And I thank you.
Okay, there was an awful lot of questions there. Maybe to start with your question about the materials we use. And you used the example of Egypt and the pyramids. But think about it. Here you had maybe tens of thousands of people building one building for one single pharaoh. You know, we're not working like this in the world today. We want to have the same opportunities for everybody. And compressed earth is a very good building material, for example. But when people gather together in dense environments in terms of urbanization, it cannot reply to the demand we have for housing. It doesn't have the durability. So we have to look at new ways. And we have these new materials coming in. They're not intrinsically good or bad. It's the way we use them that is good or bad. So we've had a lot of bad ways of using concrete, and now we need to find good ways of using concrete. And as you say, I think this comes down to how we can improve the education structures. So, for example, in the field of concrete, the developments will come from the material side, but people are not really learning about that. They're just learning about structures, how to, build a bridge or something like that. And they need to have much more education on structures. And there, I think we need to use the new tools which are available. So can be, partly from internet, but also from using virtual classrooms. This is what I'm now trying to do in Lausanne, to build a master's course for sustainable construction that can be accessible to people in all countries. So not just, the people who are, the 50 or 100 people who we are talking to in Lausanne, but, how can we get these kind of courses out there? We start to develop these massive online open courses, but we also need to find ways where people can come for short research days to build their capacities. But as I said earlier, not then just to abandon them, but find ways to work with their home laboratories. This is what I'm doing very much with our partners we're trying to form around the world. We just managed to find a donor who was willing to help us set up a new laboratory in Kenya, which I'm very pleased about, because then we can do the work more locally. So I think all of these things are things we need to think about. And particularly it does come back very much to education.
And for second question, I think the minimizing the energy usage is very, very important. So we are focusing on maximizing any kind of system efficiency. That's one point. And the second point, the renewable energy is maybe free. For example, the solar power is free and the wind free. So the establishing a renewable energy system is important or first priority issues for in the southern area. And the second point is the minimizing the energy usage is also important.
Thank you very much. A question from Portugal now.
Well, it's not only a question, some comments and then some questions. So I would like to thank a lot for Professor Hiroshi Amano and Professor Karen Scrivener for their statements and for the explanations and comments that they have provided to us so far, which I found tremendously important and very interesting. I would like to mention the importance of fundamental research, and one example that was already mentioned here today about COVID-19. So if we didn't have fundamental research for long years, we wouldn't have the vaccines and that we had almost immediately after the pandemic. So I think that fundamental and applied research are crucial. And I was wondering whether it is a question of age or if it is really a question of a certain specialization of a researcher. So a researcher can work on fundamental research for a period of his life as a scientist. And it's not only a question of age, but perhaps we are dealing here with a differentiation of culture and different parts of the world, because I'm speaking on in the Western countries. I think that we have a lot of scientists that for their lives, they are always working on fundamental research, and others that start immediately on applied research. And of course, we need these fundamental, applied, and another important thing that was already mentioned here today as well, is the importance of multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. So without the chemistry, the physicists, the mathematicians, the sociologists, historians. So we have to have all this multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity to help to respond to the current challenges and to understand the current challenges. So in understanding the current challenges, and we are here today talking about the climate change, is of course crucial for the politicians to help scientists in helping them to convey the right message. And we really need these scientists, and again, from different fields of science, helping politicians to know, to convey the right message on what we are doing, on what we really need. And one thing that perhaps disturbs me sometimes, it's about the funding. And if scientists are receiving funding only for a certain field of science, so it would not be the most best thing to do. So we really need, again, from scientists and from the different fields to influence how the funding should be defined, and what funding do we really need for the different fields of science. I would like to know if both Professor Amano and Scrivener, if they are normally called to help to shape public policy. Because it's very important to have them here today in the CSTD. It's very important that they are part of the broader discussions of the United Nations on the climate change summits and conferences. But it's really important to know if they are called to by some governments to shape the right public policies, or what you think are the right public policies. And because we really have to partner with both developing and developed countries. And so it's about international cooperation that we are dealing here as well, because only through the right public policies we really are able to change things. And it is a multi-stakeholder process here, but we really need governments to do and to act. Thank you very much.
Professor Romano?
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I perfectly agree. And yeah, for me, this kind of opportunity is a very good chance for me to appeal our activity for climate change. And also maybe this opportunity will publicize the person who are also interested in, and so to make a new relationship, a new partnership, or a new collaboration active chance. So yeah, thank you so much for the very nice appointment.
So yes, this is another complex question. I think, I mean, I'm very privileged to live and work in Switzerland here, where we have really a good funding for science. I think it's also important that we share this good fortune we have in Switzerland with developing countries. And this has been the example in our own case of working to bring this cement technology around the world, particularly in India, and now working in Africa. But I would really like to encourage all governments to think, and particularly those in developed countries, to think how they can favor this exchange, because I see so much benefit from having people from different nationalities working together. You talked about multidisciplinarity. I think in my own laboratory over the past 20 years, we've now had students from more than 40 different countries. And this is very important because it's just another aspect of diversity, of cross-fertilization of ideas. And the more we can encourage governments to put together scholarships for people to come from other countries, to make partnerships with working with laboratories in different countries, I think this will all go in the right direction.
A question from Peru now.
Thank you, President. You know that regions, Latin America region is one of the least ready to harness benefits of frontier technologies. And so my question will be this: how can we take advantage of trade, which was previously mentioned by other delegation? How can trade harness science and technology in Latin American countries, in developing countries? This is a very important questions because we are not really prepared. There are not enough public policies to implement these kinds of technologies. Okay, we are talking about artificial intelligence and quantum computing and so forth. But are we ready to take advantage of those technologies? Thank you so much.
Yeah, maybe I let Professor Amano speak more on this. I mean, because I'm not involved in artificial intelligence. We're involved in very practical technologies. And there we do have a good collaboration with Latin America. You know, we've had more uptake of this technology in several countries in Latin America than other places. And it's very much important because we can use more local materials. But I agree with you, yes, on these other levels of things like quantum computing, this is not so obvious.
Yeah, from my point of view, the exchange student would be very, very important. Maybe it's a long range program. So the first is to exchange the students with Latin America and for example, United States or Japan or Europe, and then the person who run for example, artificial intelligence for quantum computing return to their countries. Maybe they will become the leader in the next generation.
And now a question from Angola.
Morning to everyone. I'm Minister of Higher Education, Science, Technology and Innovation from Angola. I'm a professor. My background is academic, but in the last 6 years, I'm in the government. So for me, it's very interesting to see how do two researchers came here and showed us how science can bring us solutions to real problems. And I was wondering that the situation that we live now concerning curriculum is very different from that we had some decades ago, when we conceived the curriculum based on science. But now we look to the needs of society and we identify which professionals we need, and the curriculum is based on these needs of society. And for the innovation, today there is some debate concerning a linear model from research to innovation versus this model that looks for the needs of the society to do differences in research that can bring solutions. And here we are in the question from fundamental research and applied research. As a member of a government, as you can imagine, in this position, I'm faced with many challenges in a country when we have to invest in education, in basic education, in primary education, in all levels of education. And we cannot say that we will invest in higher education and we will do less in basic education. It's totally wrong if we come to this way. And as we need also to face all the challenges that the world has today, as the climate changes, we must have teachers very well trained. And for this, we need very good partnerships. I'm very interested to have some conversation with Professor Scrivener concerning this solution for cement, because Angola, as you probably know, needs construction for householding and other aspects of society. And more than that, it would be great if we can have some kind of collaborations with our universities in this aspect of structures and for training for the trainers, because if we don't have teachers very well trained, we will not be able to have very good research, and at the end, we will not succeed in our proposals for SDGs. Thank you very much. And it was very good for me to hear and to learn with you. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your questions and comments. I mean, from my side, I'm very pleased to say that we are engaged with Angola. We have the project to implement this technology in the National Cement Company is quite far advanced and should be producing at the beginning of next year. And also our partners, in this case coming from Cuba, have been working with the local university to train PhD students. And, you know, so here I'm very pleased to say this is going well, but of course we always need to do more. And I well appreciate your challenge to try and make choices between primary and higher education. But, you know, while of course primary education is absolutely critical, if this is not followed through to higher education, the problem is then the brightest and the best, they tend to go to other countries. So, you know, if to keep the talent in the country, you also need to have some opportunities for them in higher education.
Professor Amano?
Yes. Yeah. Again, the exchange of the students would be very, very important and a good opportunity to understand the both countries. So the young generation, our role is to how to push the young generation to go abroad and run the other countries. So yeah, I think the program of the student exchange would be more and more important in future.
Thank you very much. We now have a question from a viewer online. I'd like to welcome Mirza Beg from the VH group in India. Hello and welcome, sir. What is your question?
Hello. Good afternoon to everyone over here. I have two questions, simple questions too. How can science, technology, innovation be used to promote global collaboration and cooperation? and harnessed in a way that promotes equitable and sustainable economic growth rather than exacerbating existing inequalities, geopolitical tensions, or fueling competition between the countries? And my second question is, what steps can be taken to incentivize private sectors to prioritize social and environmental impact in their collaboration with governments and other stakeholders? I thank you.
So yes, difficult questions. I'm not saying I have all the answers, but certainly I think science, in my experience, has been a wonderful experience because it is an international discipline. It is really the thing that enables you to go to many different countries, speak to many different peoples across all divides and find a common purpose. So I think science can be a force for good here. Whether it is always rising to that challenge, I cannot say that because nothing is perfect. But your second thing about the private domain, I think this is very important because, as I said, this is really where so much development is going to come from. And I think this is where governments have an important role to play. Governments must strongly pressurize and incentivize the private companies to deliver on this climate change. I think this trend is now well engaged. It was too slow. I remember just 15 years ago, you know, the UN agencies were saying, oh, we only need to cut emissions from cement and concrete by 20%. You know, this will be enough. But nothing was done. And now it's crept up on us, and now the situation is urgent. So I think this is really where governments have the role to play to legislate and incentivize companies to ensure that they engage with this social process and also with the technological process of reducing, doing something about climate change.
Professor Amano?
Yeah, I also agree with at the initial stage, the government should the play a key role in the to act against climate change. But I think that if you consider the financial thing, I think for example, the renewable energy based system, we don't need to. The financial issue is not so serious. So if we consider the long range of the economy or the finance, so I think as the first step, the government should lead the private sector or private companies.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We now have a question from Ahmed El Mouna from Mauritania. Please state your question and to whom it's directed.
Hello. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
We can hear you well.
Thank you very much. I like to second some of the question and point raised by colleagues from the South, including esteemed representative of Gambia and Peru, Angola. So they kind of echo very much the kind of problem we have here in Mauritania. My question to the panel is, both point raised are competing in terms of importance. Construction in the one hand and energy in the other hand. I can't tell which one is more more of a priority because they are both so important. But my question is, what is the environmental impact of those of this alternative development? They are better than what we have today, but can they tell us in a nutshell what are the if you want the negative impact or potential negative impact of these technologies or new development on the environment in 10, 15 years, 20 years, something like that? Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of construction, I mean, we are, I think we have to look at how we can provide the basic needs of the world's population while having the minimal impact. I mean, there is a movement which says, okay, we stop building, we don't build anything more. And of course, if we have good buildings, that's great. Let's not pull them down. But in many parts of the world, we don't have good buildings. And, I mean, I can honestly say to you that concrete can be one of the best ways of providing these buildings, because you can deliver a building with the minimal CO2 impact compared to other choices. But at the end of the day, we have to find more efficient ways. I mean, we're very guilty in the global north that we make gains in construction efficiency, and these are wiped out by the fact that people want to live in bigger and bigger houses. So we at some stage people have to decide what is their footprint. We know the footprint of people in the global north is now so much higher than in the global south, because they fly everywhere for their holidays, they drive 1 or 2 cars, and we don't want to give these things up. But at some point we have to be satisfied with living in a stable situation with the earth and not asking for more all the time. I don't know what the answer to that is.
Yeah, as for the negative impact, for example, the solar panel needs a large area, and the wind power destroys some fishermen's life. So that's a very, very serious problem. So we need a much longer experience for such the new energy systems. Yes.
Thank you very much. We now have a question from Algeria.
Thank you very much for the panelists for their insightful contribution to the discussion. We would like to highlight that market-driven approaches are sometimes not sufficient to shift the paradigm on how technology can help combat climate change. For example, patented technologies are not always made available on fair and equitable terms. Therefore, mechanisms for technology transfer and technology adaptation are also important. The issue is not only to put together new technologies that support sustainable development, but how to ensure that they are rolled out on a global scale to produce impact worldwide. This is key to take full advantage of the sustainable technologies to achieve the 2030 development agenda. We also agree that the role of the state is key to create a conducive environment for businesses to invest and to innovate in sustainable development sectors. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't really have a comment on that.
Okay, but it was more of a comment. Thank you very much. Now, a question or a comment from Austria.
Thank you very much for the two professors. Professor Scrivener pointed out the importance of measuring in a holistic way the impact. In her example, it's not sufficient just to look to the production, but we have to look to all steps until turning to the concrete, to the building, etc. And I think this is the right way to do. And I would like to hear a little bit more on this, to learn, because I think many innovations are just evaluated for the first step. If we speak about electric cars or whatever, I miss many times this kind of holistic benchmarking. That's why I would be very keen to have some, to hear something more about this holistic way of benchmarking. Thank you very much.
Well, we're just really starting to engage in this process. So I can't give you all the answers, but maybe we can follow up a bit more afterwards. I think that, you know, the construction industry has just become more and more fragmented over time. So you have the architect who is designing a building, who is not maybe thinking about how he's putting in the design things that can be low carbon or high carbon. Then you have the engineer who is making the design, the constructor who is delivering the concrete. And for so many years, you know, this was just such a cheap material. It was much cheaper to use more concrete than to pay an engineer to better optimize the process. And now we have to reverse that fragmentation. We have to make these different people working together. This is really what, you know, we have engaged with 6 professional societies, you know, the Fédération Internationale de Béton, who is making the codes, IAPSE, who are working on bridges, etc., have come together and launched what they call the Globe Consensus. And this is now really trying to look at ways we can get these different actors to work together. So, I mean, we're starting the process. We haven't solved the process, but the first thing we're really trying to tackle is this question of measuring holistically what is the CO2 impact of a building, regardless of what material it uses, because we actually see that at the end of the day, it's not the materials that make the difference, it's the way the design and everything comes together.
Thank you very much. I could imagine that it's not only important for cement, but also for all fields, I think.
Professor Amano, did you want to answer this question as well?
Yeah, the new technology needs a long experience time. For example, the LED lighting, at the initial stage, many people claimed about the blue light problem, but now it is settled. So, yeah, I think the new technology needs some experience of penetrating the technology to the life.
Thank you very much. We're coming to the end of this conversation. I'd like to thank our panelists for this very rich conversation. Many key messages, of course, but I think maybe one takeaway that we've heard throughout the panel, the fact that we need to perhaps go for a holistic approach, that solution ideas can also come from all sectors. And it's about also a multidisciplinary approach. We've also heard about the necessity perhaps to reform education. And as Professor Amano was saying, perhaps one of the first steps would be to implement exchange student programs. Thank you to all of you, and back to the chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Julia Seeger, for having moderated this special event. I would like also to thank Professor Amano, Professor Scrivener, for sharing with us the important knowledge on this subject. And I also wish to thank all the speakers today. This afternoon, we will resume at 3 p.m. with the Ministerial Roundtable. The meeting is adjourned.